good afternoon, and welcome to the Columbus Metropolitan Club. From its beginning, CMC has welcomed everyone. I'm Kelly Atkinson, the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Director and the Columbus Office Administrator at Barnes & Thornburg and Chair of the Metropolitan Club's Board of Trustees. So CMC's political series is presented by the Ohio Farm Bureau. Today's forum is sponsored by Hannah News Service. Today's forum partner is the League of Women Voters of Metro Columbus. And our live stream is presented by the Emergency Response Fund of the Columbus Foundation in partnership with the Columbus Dispatch. Let's thank all of those supporting today's forum. All right. Our forum today will unpack a new report focused on Ohio's post-pandemic economy built around questions for the next Ohio governor. In a previous 2018 report, today's panelists found evidence of strength in some sectors of Ohio's economy, such as advanced manufacturing and logistics, but not enough across the board to reverse a long-lasting decline. Today, we'll discuss the profound changes the state has faced since then and what the future holds for a post-pandemic Ohio. So please welcome today's speakers. William Shkurti, Distinguished Adjunct Professor with The Ohio State University's John Glenn College of Public Affairs. Go ahead. Can I hear a clap? And Fran Stewart, researcher and writer with the Ohio Manufacturing Institute and the Ohio State University's John Glenn College of Public Affairs. And our host, Thomas Suddes, assistant professor of instruction at Ohio University's E.W. Scripps School of Journalism and a member of the editorial board at The Plain Dealer and Cleveland.com. You can learn more about today's speakers in your forum flyer. But for now, Tom, the podium is yours.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. It's a privilege to be here with public-spirited people who pay attention, because those are the people who make the real decisions that affect our society, or should, and keep those in power in check from time to time. It's also a special pleasure to be here because of the two panelists who flank me this afternoon, whom I've known for quite a long time and for whom I have great respect. So I want to thank them for having me be here with them this afternoon. I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about the report that they shared with us 4 years ago, I think it was, in 2018, about what we found the last time, what they found the last time in terms of some of the concerns they expressed before Governor DeWine took office in 2019. There are three major points with some subpoints that they recognized as being salient toward their journey of discovery into what makes Ohio tick and not tick sometimes as well as it should. The first, this is from 2018, was that Ohio, over time, has witnessed a steady decline in its economic well-being compared to the nation as a whole in more than 60 years. That is to say, we've lost 700,000 some manufacturing jobs beginning in 1969 when it peaked. I'm from part of a state where that peak occurred and where the slump has also occurred. It's made a fundamental difference in many Ohio communities across our state. Another point that our scholars raised 4 years ago, before the current governor took office, was the nature of Ohio's job market has changed. And so have the skills of Ohio workers and the skills needs of Ohio employers. But serious gaps exist between the skills employers want and the skills that Ohio employees offer these employers. And finally, governors from both parties have worked to improve Ohio's economic performance, but their interventions have not yet been able to reverse the state's relative decline. One of the points I sometimes make, either in my own writing, which is just wet straw compared to the writing of these two scholars, is that people don't often understand that relative to the nation, Ohio has been slipping for quite some time, despite the best efforts of people in both political parties and all three branches of government at every level of state government, local and otherwise, and so forth. So they recommended, among other things, that governors should create more high-paying jobs or help induce that to happen, improve the match between the skills that workers do have to offer their employers and the skills that employers need, exerting influence on national and international policies that affect Ohio, addressing the needs of forgotten Ohio, which I'm going to ask them to define for us this afternoon, whose peoples and places have been kind of lost in the shuffle to help advance Ohio's, or help in the advancement of Ohio's overall economy over the last 4 years and over the last many, many years. The key take away from the last report is the steady decline of Ohio's relative wealth since '69 compared to the nation's. And the base of that was the questions that they addressed the governor, and I won't read all of them to you. There was a number of them here to cover the waterfront. 12 questions for the next governor. He's not here to answer them, and I won't try to answer them for him. But they address the needs that the state has to confront to advance our economy and our people and our way of life. So that said, I'd like to ask Bill Shkurti, in terms of the last 4 years, the questions that were asked of the governor, and the data that he and Fran have assiduously studied, what's changed in 4 years, Bill?
Well, thank you, Tom. Let me start, first of all, by thanking, both on behalf of Fran and myself, the Columbus Metropolitan Club for having us back again 4 years later. We appreciate it, and for pairing us with one of the most distinguished luminaries of Ohio journalism, Mr. Suddes. I also want to thank, again, on Fran and my behalf, our colleagues at OSU who are over at this table who have supported this project. And I also want to make clear that any errors or inflammatory statements are the products of the authors, not the position of OSU. So having said that, the short answer to Tom's question is what's changed since the report 4 years ago? Well, if you go into the period pre-pandemic, which would be prior to March of 2020, not much. The trends that he pointed out from the last report have continued, and those trends are Ohio's economy does continue to grow, but it grows at a less rapid rate than the country as a whole, so we're continuing to fall farther behind. In fact, in your reports, in the executive summary, there's a chart, and it compares Ohio on 4 measures of economic well-being with the country as a whole, and the country as a whole is up here with a straight line that's 100%, and then the 4 things are listed, and I'll mention them in a minute, but they're all less than the national average. The first one is the one Tom mentioned from the report 4 years ago, which is personal per capita income. In the last, and what we did in that chart, so we had a long enough period to compare, is the last 10 years. So it's coming out of the Great Recession, but before the Great Pandemic. Ohio's per capita personal income grew, but at a rate of 5% less than the nation as a whole. Some of our readers last time suggested we use some other measures, like how about adjusting for inflation because Ohio has lower housing costs than the rest of the country. So we did that, and by that measure, Ohio has fallen 6% below the country as a whole. What about state gross product? That's the value of all the goods and services we produce. Ohio has fallen 9% below the growth of the country as a whole. And the big one, jobs, Ohio has fallen 33% below the nation as a whole in new job creation in that period. Now, as I mentioned, that's all prior to the Great Pandemic. As Fran and I will talk about, the Great Pandemic has shaken up a lot of things, and we will proceed with that next as soon as Tom gives us direction on which way he wants us to go.
Yes, well, we have some major plans to talk about this today, and it's very important because it's one of the central realities that we've all faced the last 3 years, as these masks we're wearing today attest. And so I'm going to ask these questions both. I have several sub-questions both for Bill and for Fran about the pandemic. So first of all, what is the impact of the pandemic? And Bill, what are the economic implications of more Ohioans working from home?
Okay, well, that's an interesting one, and that's a perfect example of all the 5. We've picked 5 things we're going to stress out of changes that have been produced by the pandemic. And to overplay a cliche, if you will, the old Chinese figure of both opportunity and danger are the same. And this is a classic. So more people are working from home. No one is exactly sure how this is going to shake out. The good part of that is that gives Ohio, particularly Ohio rural communities, an opportunity to attract high-paying, skilled people who might be fed up with congestion on the coast or crazy weather on the coast or whatever to come to Ohio. That's the good side. The challenge on the other side is, what if all these white-collar workers who work in downtown Columbus and elsewhere stay at home, and the tax money that goes with them stays at home in suburbs or wherever else? And it's a particular challenge in Ohio because our municipalities, including Columbus, are very dependent on income tax. Columbus gets 78% of its general fund money from the city income tax. And right now, for example, when I worked at OSU, my salary, I lived in Upper Arlington, but the income tax on my salary went to the city of Columbus because I worked in Columbus. Well, now fewer people are working at large employers downtown and are working at home. That can really put a strain on the finances of our central cities. We don't know yet how that's going to play out. But it could be very, very difficult. The interesting thing is, if you look at what the Columbus Metropolitan Club has done in the way of programs over the last year, they've kind of tried to stay ahead of this. And I counted in the last 90 days, they had 3 programs on the future of downtown Columbus in one form or another. The interesting thing about that is they've had a variety of people express a certain degree of optimism about how Columbus is going to get through that. I hope they are correct. Right now, nobody knows for sure, but that's something that will need to play out. And one of the questions for the next governor would be, how much do you feel an obligation to deal with that?
That's a very good point about Columbus's dependence on the municipal income tax. And I have to throw in one thing before we turn over to Fran. You should keep in mind, members of the General Assembly have exempted themselves from paying Columbus income tax unless they're Columbus residents. So privilege has its ranks and rank has its privileges and so forth. Fran, what about the labor market? What has the pandemic revealed or suggested about the patterns of our labor market in the state?
Well, I don't think anyone needs a report from Bill and me to know that workforce is a hot topic suddenly. And no doubt you've all seen the help wanted signs, or perhaps you've experienced the impact of worker shortages yourself. In Cleveland, I know that some of the restaurants still are having to function on limited hours, which is putting a damper on my well-honed cooking avoidance strategy. So it's been a challenge. But the pandemic has really simply heightened and perhaps broadened a concern that has already been plaguing policymakers and employers, particularly manufacturers. And that's, how do we make sure that we have workers with the right skills for both the current job needs of jobs today and the future jobs? And we have to always sort of keep in mind that our workforce in Ohio is continued to be shaped by the fact that we have a legacy as an industrial powerhouse. That hasn't gone away, and that plays a role in the makeup of the workforce that we have now. In our 2018 report, we wrestled with how the state's 50-year shift from being predominantly a goods-producing economy to being more service-providing has shaped Ohio's workforce. And we found that Ohio's workforce is increasingly better educated, but gaps remain between the skills that workers have and what employers say they need. In this report, we really try to wrestle with that more and focusing on Ohio's workforce in terms of both the skill that's in demand and the skill that's in supply. And in the earlier report, we noted that part of this disagreement seems to be definitional. It seems to be both how you define skill, which I'll talk about in just a minute, but also whether you're looking at total jobs that are going to be needed in the future, or you're looking at new jobs that are created. And there's a difference in the skills that are needed, whether you're looking at replacement jobs or newly created jobs. So in terms of skill supply, there's some good news. Ohio actually has done better than the nation overall in terms of getting its adult population to have at least a high school diploma. So we have more than 90% of Ohio adults have graduated high school. That's a good thing. But where we fall behind is in terms of college completion. Ohio adults 25 and over, 29% of them have a bachelor's degree or higher. That compares to 36% in the nation as a whole. So we've really lost ground, although we are slowly starting to make up that gap. In terms of skill demand, Of the total job openings, meaning replacement and new, projected between 2018 and 2028, only 18% were expected to require a bachelor's degree or higher. But 59% of new jobs are expected to require at least a bachelor's degree. So you see that that's partly, depending on what your focus area, there's a big difference there. And so while filling these higher paying new jobs is very important to growing the state's economy, their numbers are actually relatively small compared to those needed to fill vacancies created by turnover in existing jobs. It's about almost a 5-to-1 difference between replacement jobs versus new jobs. And so much of the recent debate over workforce skill has focused on the middle end of the spectrum. And so here again, there are these definitional differences as to what exactly is meant by middle skill. Typically, that is that there needs to be education beyond high school, but less than a 4-year degree. So we looked at the employment change over the 4 years before the pandemic and found that jobs requiring an associate degree, which is often the very definition of a middle skill job, those jobs had actually declined in number between 2014 and 2018. But on the other hand, there's been strong growth in jobs that require a non-degree certificate. I mean, that is actually the good news of what's happening in the middle skill jobs. But it's important to remember that past doesn't predict the future. But this does show how hard it is to craft policy when you don't really know what you're looking at. And how do you prepare for those jobs when you're getting very mixed messages depending on who you're reading? And so even more challenging is how to ensure an adequate supply of workers with high and middle skills to meet changing demand, while Ohio and the nation as a whole have to face the reality that the far greatest number of jobs that are going to be in need over the next decade are actually in relatively low skill, low pay occupations. Between 2014 and 2018, Ohio's employment grew at only half the rate of the nation overall, and the state's fastest rate of employment growth came in leisure and hospitality jobs. And we know what has happened to leisure and hospitality jobs during the pandemic. So beyond the problem of having workers with the right skills to meet demand, we also face the challenge of simply having enough workers. Ohio's labor force participation rate, which used to be above the national average, had slipped to below the national average, although there were some really good signs leading into the pandemic where we had made up ground and we were essentially even with the nation overall at about 63% participation in the labor force. But the problem is that since the pandemic has happened, the whole nation has dropped by about 1.5 percentage points, and Ohio has actually declined even more than that. So it's hopeful that once the pandemic is in the rearview mirror, some of those people who retired early or just decided to leave the labor market may be enticed back in, but that will remain to be seen if that happens or not.
And one thing I wanted to ask you about, you guys, a really interesting terminology in your part of the report, which refers to the forgotten Ohio, or forgotten Ohio. What parts of the state are forgotten Ohio, and what are some of the circumstances that make them forgotten areas?
Well, so forgotten Ohio, it primarily in the first report we were talking about the rural areas by and large, and so where they have seen huge losses in jobs, partly because plants have just up and closed and left. These are often communities that were sort of company towns where when they lost one major employer, it was absolutely devastating to their local economy. And these are also places that have seen huge losses in population because there are no jobs there, then the young people leave to find work elsewhere. So that was the original definition of forgotten Ohio, and then we have since broadened it out in this report to actually talk about some of the issues that are facing urban communities, and particularly focusing on minority employment, especially related to the impact of incarceration on being able to find jobs for workers who have done their time, paid their debt to society, and still often face employment challenges. And so one of the other ways that we talked about forgotten Ohio in some respects was the overlap with the opioid epidemic. Because before the pandemic, Ohio was already facing a different epidemic in terms of opioid addiction. And often this was playing out in some of those same communities that had already been devastated by, seeing their local economies devastated. And there is evidence that during the pandemic, the opioid addiction has, rebounded from all of the progress that we were seeing right before the pandemic, and now it's actually become a very large problem in urban communities as well. So it's not something that is confined to a geographic area. We're starting to see that being a problem, and that becomes an issue for labor force participation. It becomes an issue for workforce of how do you get people who are, how do you deal with this problem that's affecting the quality of your workforce?
Even taking that into consideration, which is very helpful, by the way, Ohio has shown some signs of resilience, has it not, Bill, in terms of this economic picture we're facing?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. So Ohio has fared better, or at least as well, in some cases better than the country as a whole, in bouncing back from the economic chaos from the, at least as far as we've done so far. In fact, there's a measure, kind of a bounce back index that CNN uses, and Ohio has been consistently slightly above the national average on that. So that's the good news, the economy's recovering, but these long-standing problems still remain, and that's how we need to figure out how we're going to deal with those.
What's your take on the supply chain problem as it affects Ohio?
Yeah.
And
Well,
what your research
that's a
shows?
classic one, and about this time last year, Fran and I were talking about how we organized this report, and I happened to watch via Zoom or via YouTube a Columbus Metropolitan Club presentation featuring Kevin Chambers, who's from Jobs, Ohio, talking about supply chain. And one of the things he mentioned is that the problems in the supply chain are probably a great opportunity for Central Ohio because of our dominant position in logistics. And that, in fact, there's already a lot of evidence that if you drive around the outer belt of warehouses and everything else. So he felt that was an opportunity to exploit, and I think he's right. The nice thing about those logistics jobs is most of them do not require a college degree and pay relatively well. The downside is most of them do not require a college degree and pay relatively well, but they aren't the real high-paying jobs that we need to attract to this state in order to get our economy really going as well as it should, which kind of leads to the other part of the supply chain issue, the discussion of onshoring. In other words, now people are realizing there's a lot of risk to waiting for stuff from China or Malaysia or wherever. Maybe we ought to bring more of that, particularly manufacturing, back into the state. And this state has a strong manufacturing base and would be in an opportunity to benefit from that, which kind of leads us up to the edge of the big elephant in the room, which I will turn back to Tom to see if he wants to introduce the elephant in the room.
Well, the elephant in the room, by some arguments, is me given my girth, but we won't talk about that. You have to have not been on Earth not to have heard endless publicity about, and good news and happiness about, the location of Intel coming to Central Ohio. And the implications of it are vast, and the possibilities are likely equally vast. But I want to ask Bill and Fran to talk a little bit about how they see the possibilities of Intel in Central Ohio.
Okay, let me kick it off, and then Fran will follow with questions for the next governor that relate from that. And our purpose here is neither to attack or defend the Intel deal as such. Voters can make their own decision. We're going to assume that that thing is going to be approved by the legislature and provides a wonderful opportunity for the state of Ohio, which we'll mention in a minute, but there are also some risks that need to be addressed, and we'll also talk about those. So I'm sure most of you have heard about it. It's a $20 billion investment by Intel to build what they call two fabs, or factories, that make computer chips. They plan to employ 3,000 people when it opens in 2025. The average salary is supposed to be something around $135,000, which is incredible. They also will employ 7,000 construction workers to build these two fabs, and the company estimates that it'll create an additional 10,000 related jobs. So and there could be an opportunity for more down the road, as Intel may make this a whole complex. So that's really good news. That's a wonderful position for Ohio to be in. The development project that it's often compared to is Honda, which has been an extremely beneficial investment in Ohio, and I'll get back to that later. And it is very possible Intel could be as beneficial as Honda, or maybe even more so, but it's not guaranteed, and that's what I want to talk about next. And starting with Honda, remember when Honda, at this point, well, actually when it was about 40 years in, celebrating their 40th anniversary, Honda provided 15,000 good-paying jobs to Ohio and another 18,000 in suppliers. So it's a great success story, one of the great ones in the country, and Honda has been a very good corporate citizen as well. But not all development deals end up being like Honda. And one of the best examples is right after Ohio announced that Honda was coming here, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania decided they needed to get into the action, so they offered Volkswagen an extremely lucrative development package to build a rabbit plant in New Stanton. Well, the rabbit didn't, and this new plant was supposed to employ, by the time it got going, 20,000 people, okay? Well, the rabbit never quite hit it off. The Accord did, fortunately, for Ohio and Honda. The rabbit did not, and they employed a maximum of 2,000 people, and 10 years later closed the plant down, and the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania was stuck with a $70 million debt. Now, we're not saying that Intel is destined to be rabbit, but those things happen. And you might say, all right, Bill, that was 40 years ago. Let's talk about something more current. 2017, the state of Wisconsin announced it was bringing Foxconn to Wisconsin. That was the Taiwanese maker of screens for cell phones and so forth, and that they would open with 3,000 jobs and would eventually create 13,000 jobs, and they gave them a huge incentive package of something like $3 billion. Well, as it turns out, it's 4 years later, the number of jobs that Foxconn has created in Wisconsin, the last number I saw was 579. Now, I'm not saying Intel is Foxconn. In fact, Foxconn had a reputation for announcing projects and not following through. So I'm not comparing Foxconn with Intel per se. But there's another case even closer to home. Last spring, the state of Ohio announced with great fanfare that Peloton was going to onshore some of the production of its exercise bikes to Northwest Ohio. That would be a $400 million investment that would create 2,000 jobs. And those of you that have followed the press know that about the same week the Intel deal was announced, there was a big management shakeup in Peloton because they weren't selling as many bikes as they thought, and they canceled the factory. Now again, Intel is not Peloton. Intel is a long-established record of success, but the chip industry is very competitive and subject to technological changes, and what we have to hope is that Intel's management is on top of that, as they seem to be, but if they aren't, it could ripple backwards. So the point I'm making here is that Intel can be a big win for Ohio and help change those curves, but it's not guaranteed. And so when we get to the part where we talk about questions for the next governor, Fran, I think, has 3 questions that we would direct to the next governor, whoever he or she is, about how they would deal with making sure, to the degree they can, that the Intel project is a success, okay? Then I want to go one step further. So let's say the Intel project is a success. What does that mean? And I think this will surprise you. So when we talk about success, what do we talk about? Honda. And that's fair. That's an unquestioned success. Minimal investment produced great benefits for the state of Ohio. But here's which will surprise some of you. The state of Ohio has in its history an even bigger success than Honda. Yes, it does. And in fact, even bigger than some of the projections for Intel. And you're going, surely I've lost my mind. What does it mean? Well, I want to ask you to go back. Some of us are old enough to remember, to September of 1964, and Governor Rhodes, along with officials from General Motors, met in a vacant lot of about 1,000 acres, which interestingly is the same size about as the footprint of what Intel is, in rural Trumbull County, or it was rural then, And they talked about building the largest and most advanced, or one of the largest and most advanced auto assembly plants in the world in Trumbull County. And that would produce 4,500 jobs to start and would grow to 8,000. Now, those of you that are old timers, do you know who I'm talking about? Lordstown. Now, you might be staring, oh, Lordstown, that's a failure. Not necessarily. And in fact, when that plant closed, it was still one of the most efficient. Ohio workers did their part at that plant. But what a lot of people forget is in its early years, Lordstown was a tremendous success. So they hired the initial, they opened up on time in 1966, hired 4,500 workers, grew to 8,000, and 20 years later, in 1985, they had 10,500 workers at that one plant. 10,500 workers at that one plant. And those were good-paying union jobs, a very successful plant. And we all know what happened since then. The competition from foreign automakers and so forth, and that plant became outdated, and it just sadly recently closed. The point I'm making here is not that Intel is destined to be GM or GM Lordstown. It's not destined actually to be Honda. It's destined to be Intel and whatever happens. The point, though, that I would like to leave with you to think about is, all right, for the first 20 years, from the mid-'60s to the mid-'80s, the Lordstown plant in Trumbull County, Ohio, was one of the most successful development, job-creating projects in the country. As it started to decline, Honda started to build up. So for the next 20 or 30 years, you had another one of the best development projects in the country. The challenge is that while both of those plants were producing as intended, Ohio still slid behind the rest of the country in economic growth. That is not the fault of Honda. That is not the fault of GM. Both those plants did what they were supposed to and more. What it points to is that Ohio is a large and diverse economy. And even if you're successful with one big project or two big projects, they're not enough by itself. You need a portfolio of projects to move forward. And the best analogy I can think of is when a sports team hires an expensive free agent. Okay? A lot of times that free agent, although we may never have a baseball season again, that free agent can be the difference that gets that team to the championship, right? But that free agent can't do it all himself. They need a team that support them, and that's where we think Ohio needs to be as well. And that leads us then to the questions that Fran has for the next governor.
Fran has some questions for the next governor, and then we're going to ask you, ladies and gentlemen, for your questions. Thank you very much, Fran.
Okay, but first I have to preface with a little bit of workforce because I just have tunnel vision that way, sorry. So the planned Intel investment, as well as other recent announcements of firms locating or expanding in Central Ohio, should help, to use the terms of our colleague Ned Hill, add thickness to the local labor market in a globally thin activity. That's kind of what we were with automotive, is that we were, Ohio's been very thick in that skill set. And so, and that's been the result of like a 15 to 20 year investment in improving the area's educational assets and talent pools. So this will have implications for employment opportunities, even for some areas of forgotten Ohio in the foothills of Appalachia potentially, but that's going to require communities to invest in themselves in reliable internet and in improving their educational offerings, both as a pipeline for talent and also as a way of attracting a workforce who will want live-work opportunities and good schools for their children. So in that respect, Ohio State has actually, I'll plug you guys, Ohio State has been bringing online a 4-year bachelor's degree of engineering technology at its regional campuses. And this effort seems to be right on time in thickening the pool of talent that will produce workers who can connect their heads and their hands in the kinds of activities that Intel and other value-added manufacturing require. So one of the questions for whoever wins November's election will be how to go about ensuring that Ohio holds up its end of the Intel deal in terms of commitments such as infrastructure and investments and incentives, but also in ensuring an adequate pool of appropriately skilled talent. On the other hand, The governor will need to ensure that Intel holds up its end of the deal, particularly around the promises in terms of job creation, clean energy investments, and environmental protections. As Bill mentioned, so the 3,000 jobs that have been projected to come with the Intel deal are expected to pay about $137,000 a year. But deals don't always pan out the way that they are promised. And so what can the governor do to try to ensure that we have that win that we all hope Intel will be? And so remaining in the workforce sphere a little, Ohio's governor will also need to honor these Intel commitments while also remaining committed to the efforts to support the needs of existing employers. Remember, manufacturers were already saying they were having a hard time finding workers. And so it has to be committed to helping existing firms and then encouraging that kind of entrepreneurial activity that is so important to the resilience that Bill talked about. We need a variety of firms in the state. That's the big lesson that we should take away from this. We need established firms, we need growing firms, and we need the new ventures that will offset the inevitable economic shocks that we will face in years ahead. So beyond these issues, the governor will also need to pay attention to local burdens of transportation, housing, and school districts that stem from the Intel deal. So what role should the state play in assisting those communities that are most affected? And as promising as the Intel win is, the benefits will not be felt throughout the entire state. And so in that respect, what can the state do to ensure that other parts, particularly those areas of forgotten Ohio, still have the ability to see their communities prosper and grow?
Tom, could I add one thing before I forget?
Sure.
As these things go, just as our report went to press, the Intel deal was announced. Rather than tear our hair out and try and rewrite the whole thing, we instead did a supplement, which is included in the report you have, that highlights what Fran just talked about and what I meant.
Thank you so much. Now, our audience is going to ask the questions. I'm looking forward to good questions from everybody here. If you have some, please come up to the microphone and address your questions to our panelists. Yes, ma'am, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Lainey Cuthbert. You saw me before on stage. I am curating the online questions, and so I have one from Kathy Fox. She asks, what do you suggest to shift the political energy in Ohio from, quote, culture war topics to solving inequities in education and opportunity?
Well, that's a good one. I wish there was a magic wand. There isn't. Now, part of this, we elect these people to represent us, so part of what they're doing represents some of the divisions among Ohioans, although I think in some ways the legislature makes it worse. Just speaking for myself and my personal opinion, if we could get fairer districts in the General Assembly, that would help. Now, we may or may not get there, but there is no silver bullet, but there are things that obviously make it worse. And if you have gerrymandered districts, it's a lot easier for people to demagogue and aim for the primary rather than the population as a whole. The good thing is the governor and state elected officials can't gerrymander themselves but they have to deal with the legislature that sets its own districts. And so I think that would be one step. But it's a national problem. I think Ohio in some ways is more civilized than some other states in the way it deals with these, but there's certainly room for improvement.
And actually, I would like to say, I'd like to plug all of the work that Bill has actually done on this report, because I know that often it's easy to say that you can find whatever statistic you want to prove whatever your perspective is. But we've taken great pains to try to make this as neutral a report as we possibly can. So it can be done. I mean, we can have a conversation and say, we have some serious, challenging problems in front of us. But there's hope. The main hope is knowing that you have a challenge in front of you and you have the data. And so if there's a will, I think we can come together around issues that people can see from different perspectives. I mean, we have to at least acknowledge that people's own experiences help shape why they see issues the way that they do. But we have tried really hard to make this a report that tries to be as politically neutral as possible and to say, what are we going to do about the challenges that we're facing?
Yeah, I think Fran makes a good point, and I think she and I will feel validated if we can raise the level of the gubernatorial debate even just a little.
That'd be a big plus. Our next question, thank you, please.
I'm Judy Box. I'm interested, I never hear any discussion about the trades. We hear about more college, more college. As long as I've been in this country, I hear high schools being compared with each other based on how many kids go to college, not how many graduate from college. Meanwhile, we have a big shortage of trades, plumbers, electricians. The factories you're talking about are going to need people skilled in metal work. I can go on and on and on about this. People coming out of prisons could come out with some trades. Kids could come out. We could reinstate shops so kids come out of high school at least knowing what a trade is. And I'm wondering where we are in this, because that's another part of it's not just forgotten Ohio, it's forgotten America. Thank you.
Well, that's true, and you now have kind of opened up a soapbox for me that I was trying to stay off of. but I completely agree. And part of this, back when I said that the notion of skills, how we talk about skills, is partly definitional. Whether there's a gap, whether we have, whether there is a gap, whether there's not a gap. Part of it is how we define what those skills are. And unfortunately, in my perspective, it's that we have defined it so tightly to educational credential. And we haven't acknowledged that people come to various skills and they gain knowledge in different ways. Some learn inside the classroom, some learn by doing things with their own hands, some learn by sitting at the side of somebody else. And we need to start broadening how we talk about skill and acknowledge and stop denigrating people just because they didn't spend 4 extra years in a classroom because maybe they couldn't afford it or they just didn't like it. And so I hope that we change that discussion. Bill and I made a point. If you read the report, you'll find out that we don't define skill that way. We make a point of saying educational credential because that's what it is. And we know some degrees help people in the labor market and some make a very distinct path to the labor market. Others, it means it takes a little bit more time for them to figure out how they plug in. And so I would like to see us change the conversation. And you're absolutely right. I was trying to put in a deck during the COVID, and we could not find workers who could do that for us. And that is an ongoing problem. And part of it is how we talk about those jobs and and another issue is that young kids aren't exposed to where opportunities are.
Next question.
Hi, I'm Bill Lafayette. I own Regionomics, an economic consulting firm. And your discussion of the problems with the municipal income tax triggered a concern that I've had for the better part of a decade over the broader funding of our local governments. As people retire and as income from wages shifts to income from retirement and savings, which isn't taxed, and as households age and spend less of their income on taxable goods, which hits counties, both cities and counties could find themselves in real financial trouble. And I'm just wondering if anybody's thought of that.
No, that's a fair question, and I think how you tax where the wealth is a continuing challenge. I think the one place I can be legitimately critical of the state of Ohio is that they established, this was 20, 30 years ago, a legislative committee that was supposed to look at taxes and particularly tax breaks for different groups and figure out what should be taxed and what shouldn't. And there are obviously some things, for example, it's called the direct use exemption, where you don't sales tax twice on something a company uses where it's paid once. There are legitimate tax exemptions, but in total, those have grown tremendously, and they've never been reviewed. And the legislature in the last budget got rid of the review committee, so if we get rid of it, maybe it'll go away kind of thing. I think that's a real failing on the part of the state of Ohio to look at modernizing its tax structure. It doesn't mean you need to raise taxes for everybody, but you need to periodically look at the way the economy's changing and make sure the tax structure follows it in a fair and efficient way. But it's a lot easier said than done.
Next question.
This comes from online from Mark Babash. He said that in Central Ohio, we are lucky that much of the economic energy is taking place here. You've talked about Forgotten Ohio. So how should the governor go about bringing up the situation in the regions that have greater stress?
One key need is for high-speed internet. If kids can't go to school because they don't have the internet, and you can't attract businesses to your community because you don't have high-speed internet, then you're not going to be able to prosper and grow. So we have to come up with a way of dealing with the disconnectedness of rural areas, which for rural communities, it's about availability. There's also Cleveland in one study was named the #1 disconnected big city in America. I live in the Cleveland area. I don't know how that's possible, but partly at least it boils down to affordability. So we have an availability problem throughout much of the rural parts of the state and an affordability problem in poorer areas of the state. And so we have to figure out how to deal with that, because you're just not going to you're not going to be able to entice businesses in if they can't get access to the internet. That's just not going to happen.
Yeah, let me build on that. So I think that's one step. And then remember, I was born and raised in Akron, Ohio. And as a kid, I could remember when the wind shifted, I could smell the rubber factories. We made fun of it. You can't smell them anymore because they don't make tires in Akron anymore. So the challenges that Northeast Ohio faces, Appalachia faces, are not easy to overcome. It's been interesting reading the press elsewhere about the Intel announcement, and there was a lot of discussion in Cleveland, the Cleveland area, why that didn't come there, because they have a big manufacturing base. One of the reasons is they don't have that big amount of unused land. I would argue another reason is that Cleveland, the political structure within Cuyahoga County is notorious for not getting along with each other. And you can snicker about the Columbus way, but in fact, our city fathers and sisters and whoever are able to work together, which they had to do to bring Intel. So I think the governor can't do it all himself or herself. But part of what some of these other places need to do is look at what their assets are and take advantage. I mean, Cleveland has some wonderful selling points. It's on the lake, you got the art museum, the symphony, and all that type of thing. Maybe instead of trying to attract the biggest, try to get the middle level firms and the younger entrepreneurs that might find a place like that attractive, and then build from there. We mentioned in the report, Heritage Ohio, and I forget the name of the other one, pardon? Something Communities, Reinventing Ohio, which are more the smaller cities and things they're doing together to try to make themselves more attractive. One of the staff members there told me that one of the things they find millennials really love is loft space in old factories. Well, we have plenty of that, so let's work in some of these older cities to try and attract millennials. And remember, I always love to talk about this, Amazon was started by Jeff Bezos in a garage. We need the next Jeff Bezos to be in a garage somewhere in Ohio, and that's where the growth will come in the future. So Intel is great, but Intel by itself is not enough. The other thing I want to mention, I want to put in a shout out. Oh, the legislature did approve, with the governor's support, something like $500 million to clean up polluted areas and make them available for redevelopment. So I think that's a very positive thing as well.
We have time for one more question, I believe.
Yes, and then we'll wrap it up. I'm Jane Scott with the Metropolitan Club. I'm really curious to go back to the gap in college education and skills education in Ohio compared to other states. I believe I read fairly recently that there's a lot of money still on the table to support students that's not being taken advantage of. So where's the perception here as far as kids not wanting to go to school, not feeling that it's a priority, parents not encouraging it, no jobs when they get done? I'm really concerned about this because this is going to be an issue that's going to live with us for a long, long time.
Well, I think at the risk of angering anyone at the OSU table, I think this is largely a success story once they get to college. I mean, kids start college in ever increasingly large numbers. Now, part of it is we're actually at the end of a demographic bubble, and so the numbers of people in college are likely to start declining or have already started declining. But all sorts of kids who graduate high school start down the college path, but far too many of them do not succeed and make it to the finish line. So for one thing, we could really focus on making sure that if you start down this path, the only way that it's really successful for you is to finish. And that's got to be drummed into people's heads, because it's just too much of an investment of your time and your money for you not to finish. And then we have to create other pathways that we show them that there are other ways that they can still get to the good job that allows them to do what they want to do with their lives, allows them to take care of their families. And then maybe we should also talk about how it doesn't have to be, if you don't make the right decision when you're 18 years old, that doesn't have to be a life-altering problem. You can still have these other paths to be able to go and get to get a bachelor's degree if that's what you ultimately need. But better, I would like to see so much better advising happening to young people when they're seniors in high school, but when they're like 7th, 8th graders, that tell them what classes do I need to get to take in order to go down the path that I want to take. I mean, I've talked to too many 7th and 8th graders who tell me they want to be engineers, and then I say, "Oh, do you like math?" And they go, "No." I'm like, that might not be the path for you then. So we just have to really start providing kids with exposure, and experiential learning would also be helpful too, to give them job opportunities when they're teenagers so that they know what's available in the area and they have an idea of what path they need to pursue.
Yeah, let me add to that. We talk about in the report something the Federal Reserve calls opportunity jobs. These are jobs that pay well but don't require college. Plumbers, electricians, carpenters. Those are good paying middle class jobs for people that want to do that. Now, I don't want to denigrate going on to higher education. Fran and I both benefit from advanced degrees. Our kids are working on the same thing. We need that part of the economy to drive us forward, but we need to look at it the same way we look at other things in a spectrum that has a place for higher education, but has a place for kids that aren't ready to go to college, but want a good middle-class lifestyle of skilled jobs that provide benefit to the economy. We also talked, to take it even further back to childhood, about a program in some other states where they seed families with a savings account for education for their children. And they claim, and this probably needs to be looked at, but that even a relatively small amount of money makes a big difference in the aspirations for kids that come from disadvantaged families. Because part of it is that a lot of scholarship money goes unused because people aren't aware of it or don't think that they can succeed. So there are a number of different things we can do.
And just real quick, I know that we usually spend so much time focusing on the lack of people with high skills, or the right high skills, and a concern that we really have to be laser focused on are the bulk of the jobs that are being created that pay like less than $15 an hour. That's not That's not a career path for most people. And so, and part of that is because many of the rungs of the career ladders that we all sort of benefited from have sort of been cut off in the way that new jobs are structured. And so there's just not that path to build from, say, a low-skill job and then work your way up the career ladder. It's not, we need to bring back some of those rungs of the ladder so that we can help people build from, develop their skills and move into those good-paying jobs.
I'd like to thank you for being laser-focused on our two panelists today, and I hope we can all thank them for their public service and their research, which is a great public service to the rest of us. Thank you very much.
I hope that you all found today's forum interesting. I especially loved all of that at the end because I preach to my children like all day long about that kind of stuff, so love that. Thank you. Please make plans to join us next week as CMC presents Organizational Leaders in Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. You know I care about this, featuring a panel of experts. And thank you to the Ohio Farm Bureau and Hannah News Service, sorry Steve, for presenting CMC's political series. Thank you to today's forum partner, the League of Women Voters of Metro Columbus, and to our online virtual seat patrons, the Emergency Response Fund of the Columbus Foundation for presenting our live stream in partnership with the Columbus Dispatch. And special appreciation to today's speakers, William Shkurti, Fran Stewart, and Tom Suddes. Yes. Thank you all for joining us. We really could never do this without you, and we look forward to seeing you next week as the Columbus Metropolitan Club presents another community conversation. Thanks, and have a great day.